Begin with tanks crossing borders or stock markets in free fall. It began in a quiet conference room in Brussels. In mid-2025, according to multiple European accounts, China's top diplomat told senior EU officials something Beijing had never said so bluntly in public. If Russia loses in Ukraine, China could be next in line for full strategic pressure from the United States. If Moscow falls, Washington is free to turn its attention entirely to Beijing. It was not a threat. It was not a boast. It was a moment of strategic honesty. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party projected inevitability. China was rising, the West was stagnating, and history itself seemed to be tilting toward Beijing. But that moment hinted at something very different. Not inevitability, not triumph, but anxiety. And the real pressure on China did not start with geopolitics. It started inside the economy. Across China, something unusual has been unfolding. Producer prices, the prices factories receive for their goods, have been falling on and off for years, with more than 30 consecutive months of declines through the mid-2020s. Real estate projects that once symbolized unstoppable prosperity now sit unfinished, with cranes frozen over half-built towers. Entire industries are producing far more than the world is willing or able to buy. This is not a spectacular crash. China has not entered a dramatic overnight collapse. Instead, it appears to be drifting into something slower, quieter, and potentially more dangerous, a structural slow break. Slow breaks rarely arrive with explosions. They creep in as systems that once amplified growth begin reinforcing stagnation instead. To understand that shift, we need to look deeper into the forces now reshaping China's economy. China is not just another large economy. It is the manufacturing hub of the modern world, accounting for roughly 1/3 of global manufacturing output. It is a technological rival to the United States in areas from 5G to electric vehicles to clean energy equipment. And it is home to more than 1.4 billion people whose jobs, savings, and expectations are tied to global trade and capital flows. If China's economic engine slows permanently, the effects will ripple through global supply chains, commodity markets, financial systems, and great power competition. The question is no longer whether China remains powerful. The real question is whether the economic model that drove 4 decades of extraordinary growth can still carry the future. The first clear signs of structural stress showed up not in politics, but in prices. By the mid-2020s, China's producer price index, its factory gate prices, had been in negative territory for more than 30 months in a row. Manufacturers cut prices simply to keep goods moving out the door. Lower prices might sound like good news, but when deflation persists, it signals something deeper. Demand is too weak, and producers must continuously discount just to sell what they make. Deflation creates a dangerous feedback loop. When people expect prices to keep falling, households delay purchases. Businesses see revenues shrink, profits evaporate, investment slows, and hiring stalls. Layoffs then push consumer demand even lower, pulling prices down further. Economists call this a balance sheet recession, a concept made famous by Japan's long stagnation after its asset bubble burst in the 1990s. When households and companies are weighed down by debt, they focus on paying it down rather than spending or investing, no matter how low interest rates go. China now shows several of the same warning signs: high corporate and local government debt, weak private investment, and consumers still cautious after years of property and COVID-era shocks. At the same time, another word has spread inside China: involution. Instead of healthy competition, firms are locked in destructive price wars, expanding capacity and slashing margins simply to survive. The solar industry is a vivid example. China now controls over 80% of global manufacturing capacity for key solar components like wafers and cells. In some segments, Factories can produce nearly twice as many panels as the world installs each year. The result? Prices collapsed, profit margins vanished, and leading manufacturers announced heavy losses and layoffs. Yet production kept going. Why? Well, local governments want to preserve jobs. Banks would rather roll over loans than admit to bad debts. Factories stay open even when profits disappear. This is how zombie firms emerge. Companies that stay alive mainly because their debt is continuously refinanced. And this pattern is no longer limited to one sector. Steel, cement, electric vehicles, and batteries all show signs of overcapacity. Too many factories chasing too few buyers at sustainable prices. Beneath all of this lies an even bigger fracture: real estate. For roughly 2 decades, property development was China's main growth engine. Housing construction fueled demand for steel, cement, appliances, and furniture, while land sales became a crucial revenue source for local governments. At its peak, real estate and related sectors were estimated to contribute roughly 25 to 30% of China's GDP. The assumption was simple and widely shared. Housing prices would always go up. Families bought multiple apartments as their main investment. Developers borrowed aggressively to build new towers and entire new cities. Local governments leaned on land sale income to finance infrastructure and social spending. Then the machine started to grind. Major developers such as Evergrande and Country Garden began to default on their debts, both onshore and offshore. Brands that once symbolized China's urban boom suddenly became examples of financial distress. Foreign bondholders discovered that recovery rates could be extremely low, sometimes just a few cents on the dollar. The fallout spread quickly. Property investment has fallen for multiple years in a row. New housing starts are less than half their peak levels. Construction activity slowed sharply, hitting millions of migrant workers whose livelihoods depended on building and selling apartments. Behind the building binge stood an enormous web of local government financing vehicles, semi-hidden entities created to borrow money for infrastructure and development. Estimates from institutions like the IMF and major banks suggest their combined debts exceed $7 trillion, and possibly much more when off-balance sheet liabilities are included. As land sales and property-related revenues shrink, it becomes harder for these entities to service their obligations. Beijing now faces a dilemma with no easy exit. If it lets large developers or financing vehicles fail outright, it risks triggering a wave of defaults, financial panic, and mass unemployment. If it keeps extending credit and rolling over debts, it props up an unsustainable model and delays a necessary reset. So far, the strategy has been managed containment. Banks roll over loans instead of calling them in. Local governments step in to finish some unfinished housing projects so that buyers eventually get the homes they paid for. Regulators negotiate restructurings rather than allowing sudden, uncontrolled collapses. These policies reduce the risk of an acute crisis, but they also risk locking the system into a long stretch of weak growth. Given these pressures, many outside observers have predicted a dramatic crash. So far, that crash has not come. China has defied collapse calls before, continuing to grow despite repeated warnings about debt, demographics, and state control. The reason lies in how its system is built. China's biggest banks are state-controlled and can be instructed to extend credit, support specific regions, or roll over loans to troubled borrowers. Capital controls limit how quickly money can flee the country, reducing the risk of a sudden financial run. The country also has very high domestic savings, giving policymakers resources to absorb losses or recapitalize institutions when needed. On top of that, the government has powerful administrative tools. Regulators can push weak firms into mergers, orchestrate bailouts, or freeze certain financial products. Local authorities can step directly into projects to keep them running. All of this gives China an impressive ability to prevent sudden collapse. But it comes with a trade-off. Every time the system dodges a crisis by adding more credit or hiding losses, the underlying problems persist. Debt keeps piling up. Capital flows into unproductive projects. Productivity growth slows. China's greatest strength, tight state control over finance and industry, may also be what traps it in a slower growth equilibrium. History offers an eerie precedent. In the early 1990s, Japan's massive asset bubble burst. Property and stock prices collapsed. Banks were stuffed with bad loans, and policymakers feared that forcing too many bankruptcies at once would break the financial system. So instead of a rapid, painful cleanup, authorities allowed banks to roll over debts and quietly support failing companies. They avoided a sudden meltdown. But the price was Japan's lost decades, years of low growth, deflation, and fading dynamism. China's situation is not identical. Its economy is larger in absolute terms, its state control is tighter, and its role in global manufacturing and trade is even more central. But the core dilemma sounds familiar. How do you prevent collapse without locking yourself into stagnation? And just as these internal strains grow, external pressures are rising too. The United States and key allies have imposed export controls on advanced semiconductors and manufacturing equipment, limiting China's access to the most cutting-edge chips. Companies are diversifying supply chains toward countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico for some strategic products. China still exports enormous volumes of goods, but a model that relies heavily on foreign demand becomes more vulnerable when trade and technology are being weaponized. If domestic demand softens while global markets tighten, the pressure inside China's industrial system intensifies. The slow break reinforces itself. This is the moment where China's trajectory becomes clearer. The danger is not a spectacular financial explosion. The danger is accumulation. Deflation that keeps returning. A property sector that keeps shrinking. Overcapacity stretches across solar panels, EVs, steel, and more. A population that has begun to decline, with the working-age cohort shrinking. External pressure on trade, technology, and capital. None of these forces alone would be enough to break a great power, but together they can create a system that grows more slowly every year. China is still powerful. Its manufacturing base is unmatched in scale. Its firms are advancing in fields like batteries, electric vehicles, and renewables. Yet the era of effortless double-digit growth is over. The country is entering a phase where each additional percentage point of growth is harder to achieve, and the structural constraints are harder to hide. That quiet conversation in Brussels matters for exactly this reason. It revealed not collapse, but awareness. Awareness that China's rise is no longer automatic. History rarely moves in straight lines. Great powers don't simply rise forever or suddenly vanish. More often, they pass through long periods of adjustment, times when the engines that once guaranteed success start to misfire. China may now be entering such a period. A slow break that avoids catastrophe but rewrites expectations. From here, several paths are possible. Beijing could push through difficult reforms, restructuring debt, opening more space for private enterprise, and building a stronger social safety net to unlock consumption. It could settle into a long phase of stagnation, similar in some ways to Japan's experience, with low growth and high control, or deeper crises, financial, demographic, or geopolitical, could force more abrupt change. What's certain is that the choices made in Beijing over the next decade will shape the global balance of power for decades to come. Because China is not just another economy, it is one of the main pillars of the 21st century system. And if that pillar shifts, the entire structure of the global economy and global order will shift with it. So the real question is not simply whether China collapses. The real question is whether it can adapt fast enough to keep this slow break from becoming permanent. And that answer is still being written. In Beijing, in boardrooms, and in quiet rooms like the one where this story began.